A warm welcome to all our participants and the panelists for today's discussion, Conservation at What Price? Bridging the Gap Between Wildlife Protection and Human Rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. We, from the moderation team, me, Ulf Schäfer, and my colleague Katharina Ruge, both participants of this year's SLE cohort, are going to lead you through today's discussion. But this wouldn't have been possible without the help of our group in the background, namely Regan Otieno, who is doing the Q&A session today, Kolja Wächter, who is collecting the questions from the chat, but also Lisa Detjen, Tom Michi, Sonja Sharma, and Anna Grzybek, and Luisa Wagenschwanz, who worked hard during the last weeks to make this event possible. But before we begin with our discussion, I would now like to hand over to Mr. Markus Hanisch, Director of the SLE, and Ms. Johanna Südow, Advisor in the International Environmental Policy Department of the HBS, for some introductory words. Mr. Hanisch, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulf. A warm welcome to the 2024 Development Policy Discussion Days online here from Berlin. As a collaboration between Humboldt University Center for Rural Development and Heinrich-Böll Foundation, we conduct this series of events now for the 23rd time. Thank you very much to our partners from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Yesterday afternoon, we already had in a hybrid panel one, a very interesting event on green industrialization, rethinking African-German cooperation for energy-intensive value chains with the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes as a co-host. This morning, we will have a purely digital format for panel 2. The digital format allows full access from an international community of discussants, and this fits very well to the developments here at Humboldt University, where the Center for Rural Development has now also fully internationalized the access to its study program, International Cooperation for Sustainable Development. So great to see the organizers at work, the 62nd cohort of the study program at Humboldt, together with the very committed scholarship holders of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Congratulations so far. And for panel 2. For panel 2 now, I wish us a contentful and fruitful discussion. Before I hand over to Ulf again, I want to highlight that we also have another afternoon panel on a very important topic, panel 3, that will take place at 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. in the afternoon today, will be titled "The Shadow of Colonial Capability: Can Germany Meet Demands for Restorative Justice through Bilateral Development Cooperation?" Also very important topic, so don't miss panel 3 in the afternoon. Let's now go to our discussion. And with these words, back to Ulf. Ulf, the floor is yours again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanisch, for your opening words and your insights on the DPDDs as an institution in the SLE context, and an opportunity for all the SLE course members to deepen their knowledge and skills in planning and facilitating such an event. This being said, I will now give the word to Johanna Südow from the HBS.
Thanks a lot. And dear Joseph Mosef Ole Shanghai, human rights activist and lawyer and Maasai winner of the Weimar Human Rights Award 2023, James E. Siche, Director Africa and from the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and Katrin Ulmer, who is an independent consultant and researcher in Brussels. My name is Johanna Südow, and I'm head of the International Environmental Policy Division at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this second debate of the Development Policy Discussion Days. And I'm very happy that you chose this topic. I think it comes very timely. Ahead of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in COP16 in Cali, Colombia this year. And also we as Heinrich-Böll Foundation have looked into this topic more closely since many years, and have witnessed how often measures that aim at protecting biodiversity in the end do not tackle the root cause of biodiversity loss, but criminalize local and indigenous communities that themselves are crucial actors for biodiversity protection, and that these measures often even accelerate biodiversity loss. So we've just last week, we have had a webinar series looking at biodiversity offsets that are often used as a solution for biodiversity conservation, but go into the opposite direction. And we try to see how we can streamline biodiversity work much more into our different topics, because I think it's a crisis that is overlooked, but often different, and yeah, it's not addressed sufficiently. But at the same time, we really have to make sure that we take the right, we tackle the root causes and do not, take work together with indigenous communities and communities instead of going against them. And we have even thought about concepts if we need, rather instead of talking about biodiversity, talk about biocultural diversity, by really combining these different approaches and think of different approaches that do not somehow separate humans and biodiversity, but rather think them as one complex. I'm very glad that we have these distinguished panelists here today, and thanks a lot for our partner for partners at SLE and you all organizing this. And also thanks a lot to my colleague, Elena Gnant, who has been putting a lot of work in the preparation of this event. And I will now hand the word back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Südow, for your welcoming of the panelists and participants of this year's discussion, and on the partnership between the SLE and HBS for making such an event possible and having the opportunity to exchange on such a current topic in international cooperation. But before we dive into the content and the discussion on the thought-provoking topic, we need to do a little bit of housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded, so if your name shouldn't appear in the recording, we would kindly ask you to leave the call. As this should be an interactive discussion format, a question and answer tool is offered and can be used to ask questions that you want to pose to our panelists. You can use this tool anytime throughout the whole discussion. Please, when asking a question via the chat, indicate to whom of the panelists you want to address your question to. In case you have any technical issues or questions, your point of contact is Elena Gnant. Please do not hesitate to reach out to her. The discussion will be held in English, but a German transcription is available and subtitles can be switched on in the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you want to follow our panel discussion in German, you have the possibility to use the simultaneous translation. To do so, simply press the globe button in the bottom bar and select the appropriate channel. Having a look at our agenda, we are going to start with a short thematic input to lead us into the topic. Following that, we will give our esteemed panelists the room for a short opening statement before we will go into the discussion. We will first have a session where we are going to pose questions to the panelists we prepared in advance. While we are doing this, you are already invited to post your questions into the chat. These will be picked up in our open Q&A session. To round off today's discussion, we will give the panelists time for a short statement and outlook regarding our topic, followed by a short summary and some closing remarks. And now I will hand over to my colleague Katharina, who will lead us into today's topic of conservation at what price.
Hello, and also a warm welcome from my side. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for attending today's discussion and by that helping to shed light on this controversial topic of conservation. In the following, we will show a thematic input in the form of a video. This should give an overview of the current state of conservation in sub-Saharan Africa and explain how conservation interacts with wildlife protection and human rights.
Biodiversity is declining. Currently, worldwide there are 157,100 species on the IUCN Red List, 44,000 threatened with extinction. In sub-Saharan Africa, animals like the black rhino, the African elephant or Rothschild's giraffe are in danger of extinction. For example, between 1960 and 1995, the black rhino population suffered huge losses due to poaching. Only 2% survived. Therefore, conservation areas are being established in order to, among others, counteract the extinction of species. But what exactly is meant by a conservation area? A conservation area is a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. In the late 19th century, colonial governments implemented wildlife conservation laws and established game reserves. These were influenced by European aristocratic hunters to preserve wildlife populations for elite sports hunting. In these areas, trophy hunting was permitted for a fee, but restricted access for African populations by the threat of punishment. Nowadays in Africa, there are more than 7,000 conservation areas which cover 15% of its terrestrial area. It seems likely that these will increase in the future. In 2022, the UN Biodiversity Conference saw 196 countries commit to protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. Within those conservation areas, there are multiple success stories on growing wildlife populations. In the last decade, elephant populations in Kenya have increased by 25% thanks to robust anti-poaching measures and habitat protection initiatives. Nevertheless, recent events have shown that the success of protected areas may have adverse consequences for local communities. For instance, growing populations of elephants repeatedly lead to fatal clashes between humans and the animals. What is more, to prevent illegal poaching, rangers are heavily armed. The so-called green militarization has caused multiple human rights violations in the past. In Botswana, protected areas enforce shoot-to-kill policies, giving their rangers permission to use deadly force against poachers. Furthermore, the distribution of land rights is highly controversial. Many of those conservation areas overlap with indigenous territories. Restrictive policies limit people's access to their ancestral lands. The only thing that has displaced more people around the world than war is wildlife conservation. International development and conservation organizations have been accused of supporting exactions against human rights in wildlife protection projects. As a reaction, important actors such as GIZ or WWF published specific guidelines for conservation projects to prevent such issues in the future. Germany stands out as one of the largest public donors supporting protected areas in countries in the Global South. The largest share of spending on biodiversity comes from the BMZ, which increased the budget from 400 million to 600 million euros in 2021. Germany is providing support to over 500 protected areas globally. What are the economic, social, as well as environmental costs and benefits of current conservation strategies? What role does German international cooperation play in reinforcing or preventing local land use conflicts? How can ownership over nature conservation be encouraged among the indigenous peoples and local communities? And now, let's move on to the discussion.
Yeah, now that we have set the stage for a panel discussion, it is time to introduce our speakers. Firstly, I would like to welcome Joseph Oleshangai. Joseph, if you want to, you can turn on your camera. Yes, welcome. Joseph grew up in Ngorongoro, northern Tanzania. During his upbringing, he has witnessed social and economic injustices, conservation measures imposed on the local population, namely Maasai. Today, he works as a human rights lawyer, an activist with a special focus on land rights and displacement. Together with his law firm, Ramat Law, he supports indigenous people and local communities, short IPLCs, in the fight for justice in local and regional courts. In 2023, Joseph received the Weimar Human Rights Award for his work. Joseph, it's an honor having you here today, and thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, and good morning.
I'm also excited to welcome Karin Ulmer. Karin is a Brussels-based independent consultant and researcher. Over the last 30 years, she has specialized in EU development policy, trade, sustainable food systems, and gender. This includes work on land rights of indigenous people and local communities, human rights, and biodiversity. Karin owns a systemic look at the EU's treaty obligation on policy coherence for development. We're also pleased to have you as a speaker today and are looking forward to your expertise on conservation from a policy lens.
Good morning.
Furthermore, I'm happy to have James Isiche with us today. James is the Africa Director for the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Among his numerous duties and responsibilities in this position is the development of model projects for conserving landscapes, as well as combating illegal wildlife trafficking. He works closely together with a vast network of different country directors, funding agencies, and politicians. Partnering with local communities that live with wildlife is a key aspect of James' work. We're excited to call you one of our panelists and to be able to enrich our discussion through your perspective on conservation.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me as a panelist. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And now to open up our discussion, I would like to invite each of you speakers to give us a short personal statement on our topic of conservation at what price, bridging the gap between wildlife protection and human rights in sub-Saharan Africa. Joseph, I would hand over the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Katarina. And again, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here this morning. And briefly, conservation at what price? When I think of it, a number of issues come into my mind, and I'll try to put them maybe in a few minutes too. Ideally, conservation is a good thing. So, you know, when I grew as a kid, I think of a biodiversity issue like protecting all the life in the ecosystem, which I think any civilization and a civilized community would love to do that. But the conservation being implemented, particularly because the topic is in sub-Saharan Africa, is the kind of the conservation that is not the conservation that I thought it should be. And I'll try to give my perspective into that. As Katarina said, I grew up in Ngorongoro, which I was born actually, and is a conservation area. So, which I think was a very good idea of coexistence, was the only single test in Tanzania, which is my country, to put all the life in the same area. So you protect the wildlife, the nature, but with the people continuing in the same area. Unlike the national parks, game reserve, which in Tanzania game control area and others are exclusive for others. But you know, the conservation that is being implemented, particularly in Africa, was brought during the colonial time, which part of the video at least says. And you remember during colonialism, there is that sort of racism within almost every single operation. So it was so more or less like a colonialist and the subject of colonialism. So the human face of almost everything brought by colonialism was not that much better, particularly for the subject of the colonialist, which was actually mostly were the Africans. And so the first idea, particularly, and I give an example of my own country, then Serengeti Ngorongoro, hunting, of course, was the first idea of the protection, and then was dismantled some years in Serengeti before independence. And then the Maasai were the first people to be moved out for these exclusive protected areas. And when we become independent, and we maybe even our fathers thought like maybe we'll be independent in every aspect, but the thinking never changed. So we have a conservation thinking which is being implemented today, now by, of course, not by the colonialists, not by the white people, by our own governments, almost our people in the neighborhood, our own system and machinery of the state, but with the same thinking of before 1950s, which, and I can classify briefly, it has few elements, and one of them is expansion. So it always is like how colonialism was, is always finding some other area, so always expansion. And how does that expansion happen? Is always military. So violent. Anyone who has followed the African, the Batwa in Congo, what happened in Cameroon, what happened in Kenya, what happened in Tanzania, and particularly with the Maasai, is every single day displacement. No question. You'll not be asked like, you prepare for where to go. Is we don't need you tomorrow, military. But again, is externally influenced, whether from foreign or even from the top, from the state. Then the real people who carry the burden of the nature conservations are always, they become recipients. So imposition from above, imposition from external. And then it has an element of, there is some elements not wanted into that ecosystem. It's like, not all the people are unwanted. If you are rich, you can pay, you can access. If you are poor, you cannot pay, get out. And this is what happens with most of the indigenous community in sub-Saharan Africa. I said, for example, the Batwa and many others, and Maasai particularly, which I can give serious evidence of that. But again, it has, I'll end in 30 minutes.
Okay.
It has,
fine. Thank you.
Again, an element of finances. So it's a business. And it has literally elements which is not related to nature conservation, like hunting. So far as you are rich, then, and the last one is, there is no human face mostly, which I said in my characterizations. So this is what I understand of the now conservation, which I think we need conservation, but the other.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Karin, would you please give us your statement on today's topic?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm coming from a development non-governmental organizations perspective, and many of those organizations working on development share the concerns that were raised now just by Joseph Olejangi in terms of the risk associated with increased money being put into the targets on global biodiversity protection that are risking human rights and indigenous people, local communities. So I'll just mention a few points that are coming a bit more from an advocacy perspective in terms of the issues we think that European governments, the EU and Germany, should address and should be taking up. So indeed, we heard also in the video that increasingly evidence shows that displacement harms people. And it's particularly it harms the vulnerable group about those people, and it's women and indigenous people, and it widens inequalities. It does carry hidden social, economic, and environmental costs. And we also have heard and see that conservation projects often follow the same patterns and priorities. with a singular pathway to development that excludes rural dwellers and facilitates the dispossession of land. So this is a kind of a structural condition often to the conservation industry or fortress conservation. And often you could say that displacement becomes with a kind of a slow violence that develops further. And we also see that if benefits occur to local communities, it is often with those which are more powerful groups within the local communities and indigenous people. So we could argue that the voluntary resettlement are hardly or never or ever hardly ever voluntary, or that they are a myth and they don't exist really. So we think when it comes to government, the first responsibility should be to do no harm. For the German government, but also the EU is committed to that principle. That would involve to uphold the right to say no to evictions from local communities and indigenous people. I mean, we have the free, prior and informed consent as a kind of a commitment existing already, to make that compulsory and to insist that it's respected. We should also see more support to monitoring the level of recognition and implementation of those rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And that would involve recognizing indigenous people, local communities categories as a distinct category, their conservation areas, and also looking and monitoring the well-being of the communities with regard to social, environmental, and economic well-being, but also the numbers of dispossessed people in a given country. There is a lack of publishing those kind of figures and agreeing on them. And then in terms of any kind of change of future, we think that we should consider and look into normalizing non-displacement alternatives in policy and in action plans and biodiversity strategies, which requires a new way of thinking of biodiversity protection and halting of the loss of it without large-scale displacements. Increasingly, there are examples that this has benefits to biodiversity and to the social, environmental, and economic well-being of people living on the land, but that would look into a different approach, much more locally appropriate, much more in situ, much more context-specific and human-scale technology. It would certainly have to increase recognition of indigenous people's contribution to biodiversity. And also one point, perhaps recognizing that there is flora, wildlife, animals, and fauna, but there's also increasingly work on fungi, or this is mushrooms, and we see that with indigenous peoples' pastoralisms, they have been some of the key drivers in terms of also helping to that kind of population of fungi in the soil and in grasslands, which has not received the research necessary yet. So in terms of demands to normalize non-displacement alternatives, we think the solutions are there already. Germany is investing in them, the German government. It's agroecology and agroforestry, in particular in Africa, and the results are promising. So we think that making money move into agriculture and agroforestry would be a way forward to go. And we would argue that, and it's supported also by scientists, that the global biodiversity targets should include agroecology explicitly in agroforestry as a contribution to the target 1, 2, and 3, which is to the reducing the threats of biodiversity, enhancing ecological integrity in ecosystem functions, and increasing biodiversity. And that should become a legalized process within the convention to have that right. And to close, one point it picks up a bit on the point that was made by Joseph on expansion. We think, and there is increasingly also now research, that there is no end to that expansion from the industrialized or prosperous societies in terms of the global resource use, global natural resource use. There is a first ever UN Global Research Outlook publication that shows that if wealthy societies continue as they do now, we will see an increase of 60% of use of natural resources in lands that is high in biodiversity, in lands and off lands that is the homeland to indigenous people and local communities. So we argue that unless we add that target to reduce and to limit global natural resource use by the rich, by those who can afford, we will not be able to address and meet the biodiversity targets. And to close perhaps with what was being said before, so if we say that local communities are not the problem, if it's our consumption, our production patterns as a problem, then perhaps we should indeed look into the biocultural diversity, which means that the cultural diverse local communities and indigenous peoples are perhaps those who can show us the way forward of how to go to a biocultural diversity approach. Thank you.
Thank you. James, please feel free to share your statement on today's topic.
Thank you very much, Katrina. I want to thank also my fellow panelists for their opening remarks, which resonate with me. Joseph has pointed out that it's the civil thing to do and the right thing to do in terms of protecting life forms in the ecosystem. And I cannot agree anymore, but this should not be done at the expense of communities that live in biodiversity-rich areas. As has been mentioned in the clip that you showed, but also with fellow panelists, is the model of wildlife conservation that we have had is one that was borrowed specifically here, most of sub-Saharan Africa from the United States. And I here talk about Yellowstone National Park, where parks were created and reserves and other forms of protected areas, but mostly speaking towards parks that were created to the exclusion of people. And in most places, of course, yes, people had to give way for these protected areas to be created. The experience here in Kenya, but I'm sure also elsewhere in Africa, is that this was done in the 30s, 1930s, 1940s, when we were not even independent. Most African countries were not. So there was no inclusivity, there was no discussions about this. And these are the challenges that come to haunt us today. But in and of themselves, these protected areas, they are not self-containing. They are never enough to even ensure that all the needs for the wildlife therein are met. And therefore, you find that there's a lot of animals that move out of protected areas into communal land, either for dispersal or moving from there to another protected area. So the communities are caught in between. And it doesn't matter the size. Joseph, Nyerere National Park, 30,000 square kilometers, which was hived out of Selous, easily one of the largest national parks in Africa and probably the world, but still using a Niassa corridor, the corridor between Nyerere, Selous, and Mozambique, still required for the movement of wildlife. So there's barring putting up of barriers, there's interaction between wildlife and people. And it mostly happens in the community areas because, of course, the protected areas are no-go zones for wildlife. I think we can have a win-win situation. Of course, we are going to talk about the issue of costs and benefits, but we can have a win-win situation because without the community land, the wildlife will perish. But with the community land available means that the community bear the brunt of the movement of wildlife. So how can we have a situation where the communities can benefit from this wildlife? How can we have them be at the center of decision-making in as far as wildlife conservation is concerned, and not people who are onlookers? Everything is going on around them, and they are onlookers, especially when there are benefits, but when there are costs, they bear all the costs. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, thank all of you for your statements. And now let us start with the discussion. And I'll give a short input. So as we heard in the video, 196 nations ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity last year. And with that, they agreed to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. One target in this regard is the conservation of large areas worldwide. In this first block of our discussion, we want to talk about the economic, social, as well as environmental costs and benefits these current conservation strategies have, especially on the local scale in sub-Saharan Africa. Joseph, I would like to hand my first question to you. You work as a human rights lawyer and activist in northern Tanzania, an area where conservation projects regularly cause severe conflicts. Could you please give us some insights on what is happening on the ground and how especially indigenous people in local communities are impacted by conservation measures?
Okay, thank you so much, Katrina, again. Briefly, and I agree with what the other presenters have said. The reality on the ground, and when we're saying idea of 30-30, preserving 30% of our universe by 2030, which again, as I said earlier, if we have another conservation thinking, maybe it is good. But of course, Tanzania is now having over 40 already. And none of them, from 1958 to the plans already on the ground, none of them ever happened peacefully. So it's forceful displacement. And because you said, what is the situation now? As I speak here, we have a number of course, cases of not 20 people, not 2,000 people, over 70,000 people displaced in Loliondo in 2022 to create a hunting area, which is neither beneficial for those people, 70,000 people, neither beneficial to the nature, literally, because you place it to the hunters. So you literally create a business for few people at the expense of the people we don't know by numbers. We have people, and actually, this is my own home place in Ngorongoro. The government says we are around 100,000 people, 100,000 people. And the government says we do not want one person by 2026. And how can we make that happen? Because there are so many tourists who are the beneficiaries of the conservation mostly, and they're not gunning them like in Loliondo, in Ruaha, and different others. Then they crumble social service, school, dispensaries, and everything to make sure you'll be living in a jungle. So you have a choice to remain and die, of course, or get out. And they say, oh, this is peaceful. So when we're saying free, prior, informed consent, when we're saying respect the right of communities who bears the burdens of conservation, but the standards are so different. What might be applicable in Berlin, in Frankfurt, by the way, is never the same standard here. So the standard here is we take away schools. So whoever wants the kid to go to school like me have to get out. And already, and this is February 2022, there is a plan already being thought to be implemented from Lake Natron to Kiteto, which the government wants to secure 15,000 square kilometers, affecting 300,000 people already living. Those are individuals. They own property, homes. They own property, livestock. All of them disregarded, you know. So when I saw the video, it says more than I can say. When it says, beyond the war, nothing displaces human beings than the current setup of the conservation that we have. Is so militaristic, has no humanity completely. And that's why I said, if we want conservation, we need to humanize. We need it to have some human face. We need the people. When we're saying conserve 30, it doesn't mean they should get out. It means, and nothing of that idea come and say, plant the tree. I never seen an organization, bigger, international, which come with an idea of planting trees. Is let the people get out. It's not literally conservation. So it is so much happening. We went to court almost like for the last 3 years. Most of the cases that I do is from conservation. the case, which I can say of the class action, all of them, the factor is this idea of conservation, and mostly all of them displaced. So people homeless, so you don't know what are you going to demand. And you take that struggle to one judge of all homeless people is not always a good things to be doing, but you don't have alternative. So it is so much happening economically, socially, to the welfare of the people. But particularly, it is not benefiting nature at all. And I can give some of the examples. When Ngorongoro was created, then in 1972, the Maasai were removed from Kreta. The crater floor, because they were living also within, but they were retained outside and several other a bit out. Then 45 after, that was 1974, it's 45 years, they come trying to assess whether it was beneficial to the nature. And they found, not us, Tawiri, half of the antelopes, the gazelles were almost like, the species I'm referring, gazelles, antelope, this small species, all of them has gone out of Kreta. Comparing 1974 and 2012, the only species that almost maintained the number is buffalo, because of course they are a bit big. Predators, of course, hyena increases because they can easily hunt. So they end up saying it was entirely not beneficial to the nature. And James says something like, we try to create exclusive protected areas, but those animals know no borders. So they end up, of course, going to the same place we're saying we're returning to the community. Then we follow and create other sort of hunting. So some people come and hunt in those areas. And that's why we have WMO in Tanzania, game control area. They are all within human settlements. And those people end up being displaced by that thinking.
Thank you so much for this very honest story, Joseph. Thank you. James, I would like to hand over a question to you. So we heard that there's an increase in the size of wildlife populations due to some conservation measures. Which impact does this have on the people living there? Are there any conflicts?
Thank you very much. First of all, yes, some species have really benefited from protection, and it is because the government or governments around sub-Saharan Africa have put in a lot of resources and efforts towards their conservation. And specifically here, I'm talking about elephants and rhino, as was mentioned in the clip. These are iconic species, so easily they draw a lot of attention nationally and internationally, and therefore resources are put to bear for them to be protected. But it cannot be said of all species. There are species that are actually in decline, and actually a lot of species are in decline. And this is a cause for worry because, yes, you can have elephants, but elephants in themselves are just part of the web. They need other species in the ecosystem. So we cannot say that we are succeeding. Of course, with the increase of these species, and particularly elephants in this case, means that the movement increases. As I said, what were designed as protected areas were not sufficient ecologically to meet their needs. And then you find that they go into areas where communities are. In some of the areas, community areas, they are still intact, and you find communities like Joseph's that are staying there. But in other areas, you find that communities have migrated or immigrated into these areas. Communities that don't practice either keeping livestock and open areas, which is compatible with wildlife conservation. So they come into these areas, they fence, they try to grow crops and things like those. So the land use changes in a way that is not compatible with conservation or even pastoralism, keeping the livestock in the manner that Maasai and other indigenous communities do. This just enhances conflict because land shrinks, You have areas where there are no-go areas because of people who do not know how to live with wildlife, and therefore conflict begins to escalate because space is limiting, and therefore contact between humans and wildlife increases. So that's a big challenge. And of course, again, one of the solutions is to have good land use plans, but also to encourage the communities that live in biodiversity-rich areas and bring them on the table and make sure that they are responsible for the management of wildlife. They have lived with wildlife. Joseph will tell you since he was born, and for hundreds of years, perhaps since the creation of mankind, these communities have lived with wildlife, and they've never had problems until we started to create these artificial constructs that have brought these challenges. So conflicts are inevitable because of the land use changes, but they are manageable if we have integrated land use planning done that incorporates all the needs of the local communities, but also looks at the requirements for animals to move. And I'm talking about wildlife here. Thank you.
Thank you. Karin, maybe to touch upon the example Joseph just brought up, a short input here. The Ngorongoro Conservation Area currently 27% of the Tanzanian GDP comes from tourism, and alone 52% of that money comes from the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. So my question to you, Karin, there is this widely used argument that conservation measures are justified by the argument that you can create money by that through tourism. But how much money really arrives at the IPLCs?
Indeed, so it has been mentioned, I think, by James and by Joseph that this is a big issue. Who benefits from money coming into? And the industries, the tourism industry is very often also financed and in the hands of either conservation organizations or local ministries, etc. But those working on benefits of tourism are very clear that there is a lot of criticism in terms of not benefiting local people, or if they're exiting and not in the parks themselves, then it's not to their benefit. So we are thinking that this approach of proposing as a solution that local communities and indigenous people have to diversify into other economic activities that are other than their current way of living on the land and from the land is a problem with our development approach. So then there is sure, I mean, industry, tourism is measured in GDP. That doesn't necessarily correspond to the well-being of people in the country, neither to the equity or equality in country in terms of the distribution. So I'm repeating perhaps the case I've been making before in terms of the whole work done now on agroecology and agroforestry and regreening Africa. I mean, there are concepts and approaches that really try to rethink how to rethink the landscape with the interactions of people living on those landscapes with the animals and the fauna, and perhaps the new, we're discovering new kind of life also in these areas with fungi and others. And that is a work that has to be done. We are very critical of proposing tourism as to replace subsistence farming, which subsistence farming is reproductive and regenerating farming of land and of people living on the land. So and we also see that the tourism infrastructure does de facto also do harm to some of the very own conservation and biodiversity objectives.
Yeah, James, please.
Yeah, if I can add, there were very big lessons during COVID when everything shut down and tourism was literally shut, globally, but certainly in these biodiversity-rich areas. And therefore, to Karin's point, I think reliance on ecotourism and ecotourism alone is a very dangerous way of things happening. We here in this region, and specifically where I am in Kenya, have also suffered before through attacks of terrorism, and again these shut off tourism. Therefore, tourism is a fickle apical industry that has its ups and downs, and therefore we need to look beyond tourism, especially when it comes to the community. The Maasai, for example, one of the communities that are renowned for their conservation effort and for hosting wildlife, keep livestock. So why can we not look at that livestock and ensure that we create markets and increase the value chain so that the livestock keeper has more resources in their pocket, and then any proceeds that come from tourism, ecotourism, then can be an add-on to their resources. And to go back to this issue of displacement, there is no need for displacement to happen for conservation to happen. Conservation, as I said, communities have lived with wildlife for thousands of years and can continue to live with this wildlife and benefit from that wildlife resource. So I know that a lot of development partners, for example, are against this issue of displacement, whether it is for creating conservation areas or even for construction of roads and other infrastructure, if there is no compensation and consent from the communities. So hopefully we'll continue to have this discourse, especially when it comes to conservation areas, and ensure that the communities that are host communities can derive as much benefits from ecotourism, but we, organizations like IFO and others who are NGOs and development partners, can look at other ways for them to improve their livelihoods, especially using what is culturally relevant to the communities. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Oleshangai.
Yes. I think that's a very interesting question. How much does the community get? I think that was the question. Last year, September, in my own village, 67 people were arrested, and their crime was to demand the government to repair the school toilets and build classes that are almost falling. That were in a place that for the last 2021 to now, the government has never repaired the window, and they say it's because of conservation. So literally, if they cannot build the school toilets, do you think there is anything that community receives? So while the tourists, some might be feeling is a good human, is putting so much to the nature, but also for the people who live in it. But those who live in it literally receive nothing other than the burdens and always restrictions. So we have gone from the restriction of not only displacements, but those of the people, because there is like a multiple land use. So people are within the ecosystem that is also being conserved. But who can, the government actually wanted to demolish 6 dispensaries, 9 schools, and they say, oh, that's conservation, is for conservation demands. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who literally do not get anything that support their life. We have people, pregnant women, who died for inability to get medical issues. In 2022, they grounded the medical flying service as a trigger so that at least the people will not get any means to get, they are crashing their own. Then private actors like the medical flying service is providing alternative clinics, treatments, airlifting as sort of an ambulance. They are working over 40 years and were told, not now, because these people will not get out if you continue doing your business. So simply, no, they are not receiving it almost at all, particularly in the place that I'm from. So this is a practical issue completely.
Maybe to jump in here, yeah, Joseph, you're just bringing up a really important point, and also maybe having a look more a bit into the German role or the German perspective. So maybe as a human rights lawyer and activist, you have some insights on what happens with the fundings and the projects and everything that is yeah, done also by the German international cooperation on the ground. So how is the money distributed when it arrives, and does it reach the communities as it is intended originally?
I have also asked that question several times, several people. The Frankfurt Zoological Society, which is implementing some of the projects, mostly in the south of Ngorongoro district, because the place I was mentioning is Ngorongoro Conservation Area, which is also Ngorongoro Division is another. So Frankfurt Zoological Society, for example, GIZ, which is also another, KFW, which is another character, of course, almost all of them getting some money from BMZ, is, if I understood it well. They say, oh, you know, we are working with the people, but who people? The place they are working, because they're working in Ngorongoro Serengeti ecosystem, which has Ngorongoro within it, which has Loliondo and Serengeti. They always says, particularly Frankfurt Zoological Society, that we are not working in Ngorongoro. But the multiple land use report of 2020, which was submitted to UNESCO this year, one of the recommendations UNESCO, Frankfurt Zoological Society, among others, issued in the place say that they say always they are not working. They say reduce social service so that these people can get out. So then in 2022, the government come and say, actually they wrote a notice saying the following school should be demolished within 30 days. And imagine, like, we are so much noise preventing the government from demolishing its own schools, its own dispensaries. But some of the characters who are the conservation group have all recommended, and it is public, that one of the means reduce social service. How? And I ask, like, and they say, no, this misinterpretation. Have you ever told them, how can you reduce? Because they're demolishing as part of the reductions. So how is the money, for example, from the German actors ending with the community? For Ngorongoro Conservation Area, the place that I'm from, completely no. They're not working in anything that end with the local community, for example, the Maasai. In Loliondo, they have some sort of thing they call Kokoba, is like community banks. But, and I have asked this question of me. So the government wants 1,500 kilometers for hunting by the Dubai royal family. But the people lobbying Frankfurt Zoological Society, and they did multiple land use last year, rejected by the councillors 3 times to justify what the government taken with the barrel of gun in 2022. The councillors wrote letters telling them, please stop. We do not need this thinking. Let the government kill us with its own weapon, but not with the aid in the eyes of conservation. You want conservation, why don't we fight all against hunting, which is not in our interest, not in the naturalist interest. Of course, there are some road, of course, that I know. There are some schools they build, but sort of in a trade-off, like you get out, so you get schools. And we need schools in our own environments. And the conservation that I need is the conservation that we work with the nature, as we did prior to the colonialism. Nature and the people were coexisting before that, and I think it can still do, which I saw one of the questions saying, is the multiple land use of the Ngorongoro a bad idea? It was a brilliant idea executed with bad intention. It was very possible to coexist and take charge of their own affairs and of the nature, of course, which I believe the nature benefits, the people benefits. But now is you create poverty as a weapon for the people to get out. You like schools, imagine like a government in 21st century fighting to demolish its own school. And they say, you know, propaganda is one of the elements. They say, you know, we never knew this school existed. But it's the government that built it in 1980s, some of them. One of them was built, I was in primary school myself. Some of the police station, must never, and they were employing police all since 1979. Churches, imagine that. So it is not only tourist money is not ending with the community, even the donors, donor funding, which is so much, you know, conservation is getting a lot of money from donor community, Serengeti ecosystem. But you go to the Western, people are killed so much, at least in Ngorongoro, they're not being killed. You go to the Western Serengeti, the Kuria community are being killed like animals. You know, they are a bit hunters, so they consume wild meat, unlike the Maasai. So they can illegally, of course, enter into the Serengeti, but the punishment is death penalty. You'll be shot. In the same, so you cannot pour a lot of money in the, and I'm finishing, Katrina. You cannot put a lot of money in a militarized system like our TANAPA, our tower, our Ngorongoro conservation area. You need to put money, decolonize the thinking, put them into a more civilian, and actually the former CJ, Chief Justice of Tanzania, last year presented a report to the president that says there are too militaristic. We need a new thinking, which I think was right.
Yes, you brought up a really important point here. And Karin, as Joseph just stated, there are a lot of also human rights violations related to conservation projects. But Germany, but also European institutions implemented safeguards which should hinder these kind of actions. So maybe can you tell us a bit about these safeguards, how they should play out, and maybe also how binding are these safeguards?
Yeah, so the safeguards are either they come from development finance institutions who have built-in safeguards, or they come from commitments to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that declaration has the FPIC commitments, which is the free, prior, and informed consent, which should be binding on any kind of land-related investment in Africa from whoever is doing that. And many of the development NGOs are advocating for these free prior and informed consent to be binding. However, the evidence suggests and seems to suggest, and we hear it from from Joseph, that in practice in the country, it's not necessarily effective because there are power dynamics. There's money coming that shapes and drives different actors to be in the forefront. And we also learn if you would take FPIC really serious, you would have to insist basically on everybody within the community to be able to give their free opinion if they would want or not under which kind of conditions to move or not, and then to which kind of land, if land is becoming scarce. So we're thinking that safeguards, yes, we keep them, but perhaps it's keeping the safeguards and making them important is also an entry point to make the case either with using the human rights or exposing where the systemic violations of these rights are keeping to happen. And then we can bring it to different kind of institutional setups that allow to make cases and to demonstrate where safeguards are not respected or not even implemented. But I do think there is a real problem with the money drives the show, and there is no way or means for indigenous peoples or civil society defending safeguards, etc., to make sure that the drive and the thirst or the thrust for accessing land elsewhere. So if I'm talking as a European, accessing land in Africa to declare that as biodiverse rich areas is a conflict in itself, because we are destroying our own land in terms of, if I could make the link to Europe, because we are destroying our own land in Europe in terms of increasing monocultures, intensifying European agricultural production, which destroys biodiversity here. And then the solution is to create special zones elsewhere, which is a big dilemma. And that has been, I'm responding to a few of the questions in the chat. That is a response then also a question of the European Green Deal, which is now at stake for the European elections with regard to Europe doing its own homework of reintroducing biodiversity into its existing land and working on land, which is the agricultural and the common agricultural policy, etc.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Yes, Joseph brought up already like a case example from Tanzania. Maybe do you also know about some areas or a region where the funding also led to reinforcing conflicts around protected areas, even though it wasn't intended?
Well, there are cases in Cameroon, there are cases in Congo. Then there are cases in other continents also, in Asia, etc. And it's documented, and indeed well, the one term that is circulating, that is also used by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, is the fortress conservation. So the fortress conservation attracts money somehow, because it's perhaps also here, it's difficult to rethink and to see what dynamics, also political dynamics, are in the ground. So once you go for declaring an area as a kind of a natural park, etc., it's easier, or the government responds much more positively to it than if you have to rethink how to integrate landscape with anybody. So there's documentation on the Cameroon and on Congo Brazzaville, and there's also been, as some of you may know, there's been cases launched by Survival International against practices by World Wild Fund with regard to paying or being involved in information networks and in militarization in terms of paying for military equipment for guards, etc. So these are cases that we're seeing ongoingly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Isice, as Karin Ulmer already brought up the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but also the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which were set in 2007 and 2022. There are a lot of international mechanisms in place which should favor the role of IPLCs in general, but also when we talk about conservation. So yes, as we see these safeguards, as Karin and Joseph just said, more or less being implemented into the conservation frameworks. What the positive or negative effects does this have on the conservation efforts that are done and also supported by the IFAW?
My apologies, I always forget to unmute. Thank you very much. There is, I think, a movement, not as quickly as or as fast as we want the changes to occur, but there are changes in terms of thinking. Certainly development partners, some governments are also changing the way of thinking from the past. And certainly us as NGOs also have to change with times. One constant is that, as I said before, that wildlife is diminishing across sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of very few. So as the saying goes, you cannot keep on doing the same things and expect different results. So we must stop this issue of just concentrating in protected areas. We must stop this issue of thinking that the best way to ensure that wildlife survives is to displace the communities. I think that's archaic thinking, and we need to work around that. So in terms of even how we NGOs work, of course, safeguards are very, very important. We are working, of course, to create space for wildlife, but we cannot create space for wildlife without looking at the interests of the local communities that host this wildlife. And I must say here, I know that in Tanzania and certainly in Kenya, there are places where there's wildlife where there is no national park. There's no reserve anywhere near, but the wildlife exists there. And it exists courtesy of the community harboring it. Otherwise, the government has no eyes there. They have no resources to take care of all the wildlife that is in some of these areas around East Africa, and particularly Tanzania and Kenya. So it's the community that is the security for this wildlife. So why should government come to such an area and remove the community and put and put that area under conservation when already the animals were secure and living harmoniously with the community. So the important thing is to get in terms of securing of space is to get a solution that is win-win. Get the communities themselves, who are the landowners, to be part of this and to give their consent for whatever conservation measures that need to be taken. For instance, we have wildlife management areas in Tanzania, and we have conservancies. Before, these conservancies were have been like mini protected areas or parks, where again, you say the communities cannot graze in a conservancy. But why not? And this new thinking now is, yes, you create a conservancy, which can be used for, of course, conservation, ecotourism, but it also is available for the community. You find that some of these areas are probably dry season grazing areas for the same community. And you're now telling them, no, you get out so that we can create land for conservation. But both of them can coexist. And that's something that we are increasingly trying to pursue as a conservation agency, to ensure that any work that we are doing is not a displacement, but rather doing it together and with the consent of the community, and that the community's needs are addressed, including their own livelihood aspirations. Because why would they harbor elephants at the expense of their own livelihoods, at the expense of their own families, at the expense of their own communities? So that balance must be struck. And for it to be struck, the community must be at the center. Everybody else who comes there, whether it's government or NGOs, are coming to a situation where the community already exists. They live there. That's their permanent home. They don't have an option of tomorrow going to somewhere else. An NGO can move, a government agency can move, but the community, that's their heritage. That's where they live. So how can we help them to ensure that they meet their livelihood aspirations and thrive like other communities that are not in biodiversity-rich areas? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me give a short input to our third block, which is very related to what you just said, James. So according to the United Nations, 80% of global biodiversity is protected by people living there, by indigenous people and local communities. Knowing that, it seems very paradox that the displacement, resettlement, however, of IPLCs from conservation areas sometimes seem to be foreseen as part of a successful conservation project. So in the following, we want to put IPLCs and their agency in the center as we discuss the question of how ownership of nature conservation can be encouraged among IPLCs. And Joseph, we were already talking about the fact that there are many stakeholders involved in conservation projects, and then there is a huge power imbalance between these actors. And I want to know from you, you are a human rights lawyer and you present namely Maasai in major regional and national courts in order to fight for their rights. However, over 95% of cases against such a powerful actor like the Tanzanian central government fail due to bribery and corruption. How does that influence your work as a human rights lawyer, and what other ways are there to fight for IPLC's rights?
Like there was a bit of a network cut when you were stating the question ahead of the last one, when you said like what influence the IPLC.
Okay, I'm going to repeat it. So
Yes.
yeah, my question was, you as a human rights lawyer, you represent Maasai in front of also national courts. And I wanted to know, because I read that there are over 95% of cases against the Tanzanian central government which fail due to bribery and corruption, and how this influences your work and what you wish for as alternatives to fight for IPLC's rights.
Okay, thank you. Which I signified a bit earlier when I said, and this is my belief, it's always difficult to take a general struggle of all the people to one person, even if that person is me, either by mistake or corruptions or any influence. Then it means the life of 1,000 people are in danger. So courts, and particularly our court system, you know, is so much of the challenge from timely justice. For example, we had a case we filed. I will not go to the detail because it's still pending. We filed on 13 June 2022. And this relates to the government, like they wrote a letter. They wrote it is confidential, but we have it, telling the government officials, please, the money we previously put into your account, we have a recovery account. We don't want any money in Ngorongoro helping the Mas community. So we said, no, we cannot tolerate this. And we filed a case on 13 June. And this morning I was chatting with my friend, like, is our case scheduled for hearing? Of course, it was in the Supreme Court. No. Assume we are depending on that case to deliver justice to pregnant women. Actually, one organization says they were not able to vaccinate and advise 7,000 women. They were not able to vaccinate 31,000 children. In the 16 months, they were not allowed to do the work. If that case was the one to deliver justice for them, then that is a justice never achieved. So it's very challenging, but at times we have to get moving because there is no alternative. So we struggle. There are some partial success, and particularly because if there is no other, then we try to use that channel which is available to ensure that at least we can, even that partial, it might be of benefit to us. So we go to local courts, we also assess the situation. We know some of these cases, you will never get anything. So we try to the regional courts, the East African courts. Sadly, the African courts, the Tanzania has shut the door already for access by individuals and CSO. The court is in Arusha, is literally 3 kilometers from my office, but you don't have access to it. That's African court. This African court, so delaying, but of course there are some outcomes, partial. Jurisprudence in human rights is not that much good like African court. African court has a very good jurisprudence in human rights, which I like it. East African court is trying, by the way, but it might be not the problem of individual judges. For example, the notice I got today is they did not got remittance to undertake the sessions. So the June session has been cancelled, all of it. From the first instance, the appellate has already cancelled for the May because the state parties, which were the one we are suing, has not remitted anything for the judges to undertake their sessions. Then you have to come back to the local courts with the problem again. So it's the struggle, but I think there is a silver lining somewhere. So, and at least when the people have a courage to go to court every single day, and particularly there are circumstances, you are homeless, your home has been dismantled. So you have nothing to lose. Going, whether they are bribed, whether they are influenced, you have lost already. So you are going to test your other alternatives, whether they work or no, like shattered dreams already.
No. Even more important that you are active for them. Thank you so much. James, the International Fund for Animal Welfare views IPLCs as custodians of wildlife and works closely together with them to ensure holistic conservation. What are concrete measures the IFAW is undertaking in order to empower the agency of IPLCs over nature conservation, and which challenges do you face along that way?
The fate of local communities and wildlife is intertwined. And I'm talking about communities like Joseph's here. They want open land systems because they live in arid, semi-arid areas, and seasonal movement is necessary. When it rains, they have to be in certain places. When it's dry, then they go back to certain places. The same is mimicked by wildlife. So when you get fences coming up, and I'm talking about fences because we are also talking about other external issues happening here. Our populations are growing in Kenya and certainly Tanzania and in sub-Saharan Africa. So when people grow, they are also displacing both wildlife and local communities. Communities are beginning to subdivide land that was previously open. And this is how this fencing is coming in. Not only are they subdividing it, they are selling it. And this is their ancestral, land. But because of challenges with trying to meet their livelihood needs, they're selling it to people who are just coming, and some of them are land sharks, just coming to take the land off communities and selling it to to other people who have no interest in the way of life of the local community or of wildlife. So I'm saying that the survival of communities in these areas and wildlife is intertwined. So the question is, how can organizations like IFO help? Because of, for example, now in Amboseli, which is not very far from where Joseph is, the area that we're working there, the group ranches, which were communally held, are subdividing land. So we are encouraging them, even if they subdivide the land, because now they have their own titles, and the land has been divided to individual parcels, they should not sell the land. They can still keep it, practice their own form of livelihood, which is pastoralism. But because part of the land also has wildlife, use that wildlife for ecotourism purposes. So that can be done in of course, as I said, in consultation with the local community. So they keep their land, encourage them to keep that land intact through instruments, and there are quite a number of instruments that can be used for that land to be kept intact, but still belonging to the community. So they are not disenfranchised. They can still have their own pursuits, livelihood pursuits, also conservation. So working with them, some of the things that we have done is, because there's wildlife there, we have community rangers instead of government rangers. And community rangers are members of the community. They know the areas very well. They know where the wildlife is. They know where people use what areas are used by wildlife during what seasons, and therefore they can, in themselves, be better guardians of the wildlife. They can also help in terms of conflict, because they can provide early warning to members of the community. So we facilitate these community scouts by giving them the equipment that enables them to move around, so that, of course, they can attend to conflict situations, but they can also conserve the wildlife in the manner that the government agencies does, but with a human face. So no guns, more or less trying to mitigate conflict through negotiation, and also preempting it when it comes to conflict between animals and people. So giving them equipment, including radios, including vehicles, including smartphones, so that they can do that and make sure that the areas that they are managing are safe. And that safety, if it is secure for wildlife, it is secure for livestock, it is secure for people, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Karin, we already heard that it's also very important for IPLCs to have land rights, so that they actually have a right to say in decision making when it comes to conservation projects, and to their own benefit from conservation projects. Do you know any frameworks or frameworks where land rights of IPLCs are already implemented or included?
Well, I think that the tenure guidelines, the voluntary tenure guidelines on should become a binding requisite in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we would need some of the existing, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, to become part of the Convention of Biological Diversity, and they could be integrated in Target 3, referring to it, that these exist, and that the Convention of Biological Diversity refers to the existing declarations and commitments, and makes it a kind of a precondition for anybody who receives money under the Convention of Biological Diversity would have to comply with these kind of rights. And in there are guidelines and standards, and also the free, prior, and informed consent. So yes, there's also work from some organizations doing on the different kind of Rio conventions, because on some of the other in the UN on desertification commitment, the UNCCCD, correct? Yeah, there you have already a binding commitment to the voluntary 10-year guidelines. So there could be a cross-reference to existing other conventions. So indeed, it's possible, but it would need a commitment. Why not from the German government to say, yes, existing human rights conventions and commitments can and should be referred to as binding in the any kind of renegotiations or submissions to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Though and then there's also an existing framework at the African Union level. I'm not sure how much it is in the public, but there's been work done by the African Union Secretariat on the land governance strategy with involvement of many of the civil society in Africa. It's quite comprehensive. It has very concrete recommendations, also with reference to the commitments by the African Union and African member states. So that is another avenue to try to really put that back to the national level. And then we have the right to food, which is translated either in the UN drop, in the right of people, peasants living in local communities living on the land. And I think the possibilities are there. It needs to be either one government or an actor who says this has to become a binding requisition. And then, if I may say, there's also, I mean, the organized indigenous peoples forum, etc., have also made proposals of what kind of governing structures would be needed that allow indigenous people to be organized at the top level when the decisions are made on the frameworks of the global biodiversity convention. So in terms of the national action plans and the biodiversity strategies, who has a say when it goes in there? We also see that some of the conservation agencies or organizations do not have in their governance structure meaningful participation in decision making of indigenous people's organizations. So there are ways to do that.
Thank you. Maybe as the last question of our discussion, Karin, I would like to go to you and ask another question. So when we talk about ownership of IPLCs over nature conservation, I feel like we must also talk about the responsibility of governments, NGOs, but also each individual citizen in the global north. What specifically can they do to contribute to conservation in line with human rights of IPLCs in sub-Saharan Africa?
Individuals in the global north?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very large question. So I think go voting, go vote for the right parties and people at the EU level, which is upcoming in 10 days, in terms of those who are really putting and recognizing that cultural development, people's development, I mean, planet prosperity, people, wildlife, biodiversity has to go together hand in hand. And the European Green Deal was a sincere effort to take our responsibility, and our responsibility is our European governments, the EU, German governments, but also we as citizens, because it seems that in surveys, we often tend to say, yes, we are in favor of more ecology, more biodiversity, more organic production, more ecological production, but in the supermarkets, on the fields, we don't see that commitment being translated. And I think there is perhaps we have to rethink also our aesthetics. How do we see landscape? What is a beautiful integrated landscape? Is that a clear-cut one? Or is it something where we start to see how people, animals, flora interact again and have some more wildness in the European landscape and fields to recognize that we can't just go ahead with investing in intensive production at the price and cost of people in other countries, third countries. So there's a whole avenue of what we could look at in terms of citizens' behavior and responsibilities when it comes to a transition that is really much more respectful to biodiversity and to a common future.
Yeah, thank you.
And may I just, it's a bit
Sure.
general, but there's one figure which is striking. I don't think I've mentioned it, but every year we're using 100 million hectares are destroyed of healthy land worldwide. So this is because it's our consumption, our production and the way we're living, and that includes the rich are those who can afford to be tourists. So we also have to perhaps revisit how we travel, how we work, how we visit other people, and how we share that, because it's if you don't address our thirst for energy and for land of other people in other countries, it's not we won't get a change.
Yeah. So, yes. Super important that we have this included in our discussion. Thank you so much, Karin. Yeah, thank all of you three for this lively and also very honest discussion. Really, thank you. And as you have seen, our audience has been following keenly and has posed some really interesting questions in the chat. So I would now like to hand over to my colleague Regan for the Q&A.
Okay. Sorry for the technical glitch. Great. Welcome everyone to our Q&A session. As you've heard before, my name is Regan. And today, together with my colleague Collier, we have sorted your questions. And I'm happy to present them to our panelists. And since we have so many great questions from our lively audience, I would like to ask our dear panelists to keep your answers rather short as possible, so that we can tackle as many questions as possible. So my first question goes to James. The first question I will pose to James: how does your organization HUB deal with the human rights violations in context of conservation?
Thank you very much, Regan. The work that we are doing mostly is working with communities more than with government, where these violations have been recorded to happen. So we work with communities, ensure we go through the FPIC process, which has been talked about here before, so that we are ensuring that we are leaving no one behind when it comes to decision making. For example, for land to be set aside for conservation. We absolutely do not believe in the issue of displacement people, and I think that just like Karin talked about, having a landscape approach is one of the things that we do. So when you have a landscape approach, it means that we are also looking at the local communities that are there, because they're the hosts and their needs. So you don't have to really exclude them. Where we work with governments, of course, we do not provide firearms. I think that's most NGOs do not deal with anything to do with firearms and stuff like that. But we also ensure that we incorporate human rights into any. If let's say it is capacity building that we are doing, we ensure that I said before that the issue of local communities and wildlife is intertwined. So keeping the land open allowing for movement of livestock and wildlife with seasons is something that we encourage. Where there is potential for the land to be lost, as I said, because people are coming in and opportunistically buying the land and using it for other means, but also disenfranchising the community, ensuring that that land remains in the community. Even if we have to compensate for it to come back to the community, but it remains in the community so that they can meet their aspirations. Of course, land use planning must have elements of where there is possibility of growth of crops for food consumption, that it is available. It must also have elements for settlements, because of course, even if the community moves around with seasons, they require their settlements, social amenities as well. And I think for me, one of the ways, and I might digress in here, but I'll just mention it. One of the ways that government and also development partners can help with this integrated land use plan is to put in smart investments that allow for social amenities to be provided in these landscapes, and not put in investments or activities that would further increase the conflict between humans and wildlife, because some of them do. If, for example, you are encouraging dryland farming in an area that you know is used by elephants or other species to move around, then inevitably there'll be conflicts. So the landscape approach would ensure that at least we have coherence in terms of land use that avoids conflict. Thank you.
Okay, great. My next question goes to you, Karin. Which changes would be needed in Montreal Common Agreement to ensure that the rights of the indigenous and local communities are really respected?
Well, as mentioned earlier, I think that target 3, which is the aim, the target of 30% of land by 2030, should explicitly ensure that there is free, prior, and informed consent in there of indigenous people and of local communities. And a revised text should also, or could also, include equitable governance reference, in addition to equitable management that also refers to the right of self-determination by indigenous people, which then would address issues of what to do on collective lands and territories and issues around tourism, or what kind of agriculture on the land, and what kind of integrated landscape. So it's the suggestion is to look into target 3 and make sure that this refers to the existing human rights commitments.
Okay. And as a follow-up question, there's one question on what are the current approaches with conservation areas that actually beneficial to biodiversity conservation beyond the flagship species that are usually targeted?
Well, we see there is more and more research at the European level, and by the European Joint Research Center and by different kind of agencies, that this new approach of agroecology, which is supported by the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and is supported by these 13 principles, by the high-level panel of experts, does show and does provide the scientific evidence that this does reproduce and recreate biodiversity and increases it on the land. And the Agroforestry Center in Africa has been doing lots of work and has been doing lots of systematic and comprehensive agroforestry projects that do show the benefits, but this is not conservation industry or efforts. This is a comprehensive systemic approach how to rethink agriculture plus biodiversity plus wildlife plus people on the land. And I think that's the area we need to go.
And the last question to you, Karin, what lesson can Germany and EU in general learn from Africa when it comes to wildlife conservation and potential human-wildlife conflict?
Well, you could consider the wolf in Germany, the discussion of the wolf in Germany. I think it's 300 wolves in Germany. at the moment, and the discussions around the wolves is heated at all kind of different levels, at political, but also individual, private, communal level. So if we realize what it means for people living on the land or living close to these wolves, I think we would perhaps be, it would be good for us in Europe or in Germany to reconsider what does it mean to rearrange and allow wildlife to be where we are, and then perhaps we would all be much stronger in supporting that human people living there really have to have a say and have to be gearing the process of how to administer and manage any kind of national declared parks. I mean, in Germany, the national declared park in the Black Forest has been a huge, lengthy process with lots of very clear targets that the local community had to benefit. Otherwise, there would not be any park. So perhaps we can, look at what it really means and takes to create something that we all can live with or agree on.
And also, one of our participants wanted to know what is the role? I know I said the last, but what is the role of EU? What role does EU play in this conflict, like in general?
Well, I do think that this kind of productivist approach that the EU has unfortunately been producing and promoting for a long time, so getting out of subsistence agriculture and of an integrated landscape into efficient and intensive and high-yielding agriculture, that has to be highly criticized. The European Green Deal was a genuine response to that, reducing pesticide that kills biodiversity in the soil, in the plant, and also harms animals being exposed to biodiversity or nitrate pollution, water pollution, etc., which Europe is exporting. Companies make lots of benefits of exporting these very unecological ways of living. So I think, again, it's a strong plea, given that the campaigns are really have been trying and have been advanced of trying to kill this kind of ecological transition, that we really need to reinstate and reinvigorate. And there's been the nature restoration law high on the agenda at the EU. We do also need it much more forcefully. So there are lots of European projects that should that need political support from citizens and from anybody interested in designing solutions that are really future, providing us with a future.
Great. And now to you, Joseph, what is the role of the civil society in Tanzania, for example, in exposing forced displacement and human rights violation?
Okay, thank you very much. I think civil society in Tanzania are trying to expose, of course, with common challenges, and common challenges because for the 6 years, 2016 to 2021, we are literally in the reign of terror. So trampling of the CSOs, media, and different others. And now, while some people feel like there is progress, majority of the civil society are trying to be as close to the government, even the media, to be safe. And this is one of the challenges. So there is like sort of a self-imposed maybe fear, or maybe it is apparent, but again, censorship sort of from the CSO and the media. But some are trying, of course. For example, the case I'm referring into, some of the NGOs, civil society are in the front line working with the community. It's challenging, but at least they're doing something.
Great. Now this takes me to the next question, which is, do you have any positive examples from projects from Germany with BMZ, KfW, and etc. That actually benefit the local communities? And do you know of a positive example from also tourism industry that benefits the locals?
Okay. From the German funded institution, I'm at least aware of some of the schools and I think dispensaries in Loliondo, which that's a direct benefit to the community. Which I said earlier, sort of a trade-off, of course, but at least there is something. From tourism, no. The only tourist project that I was aware of benefiting the community direct in a village known as Solosokwan, but has been cancelled by the government. So the money now go to the central government. They were paying school fees at least for the kids in Olosokwan. Is not from a German-related institution. The only Germans that I'm aware of is some of the schools and dispensaries, in Loliondo.
Okay. And
Yeah.
what would a right kind of conservation look like, and how can the current conservation practices be changed?
Okay, in short, because I think it's a very big question. The conservation that I think, which I said we need it, is the conservations I'm referring to the people here, the real people, the common people on the ground should be the one to take charge of their affairs in the ecosystem. Second, I never believe tourism is synonymous to conservation. So I want a conservation that is not influenced by money, either from tourists or hunting. If we need some money to support the community, but not with the interests of others people. But again, we need really the conservation that benefit the nature. We have like so much of the donors, so much of the tourists, but you ask them, you people, those managing, have you planted one tree? No. They don't even know. So it's sort of a protection other than conservation. So the conservation that we have is more military, is protection other than conserving. They don't have idea of conservation. So you want to protect, you protect a forest, you don't conserve it, so you give them guns. We need the people who trust the mind, not the guns. And how can we change this? Of course, we need to overhaul the thinking. One, the thinking that we cannot do it with the people in. So exclusion, but not all the people, of course. If you go to Serengeti today, there are 5-star hotels. But of course, Maasai are not allowed to build a school class because they say is not environmentally benign, is not environmentally compatible. But if I start do, there is so much of the ethnic and sort of division in our conservation thinking that, for example, take an example of hunting, which is allowed in Tanzania. You have so much of the money you can pay, you're allowed to hunt. Then you have an adza, which hunting is their livelihood. They go to hunt, the name change from a stakeholder as a trophy hunter to a poacher because he's poor. So the only way we can breach that is one, to remove the hunting entirely because it's not benefiting either. Then we have a sort of a conservation that the hadza feel this was the life before intrusion of external forces, which I believe it is very possible. But we need to decolonize the thinking, not like an African problems, not like indigenous people problems. We need to think indigenous community has a role to play into it, and actually it should be the central part of it. And more particularly, land should remain their property. So we conserve with the land remain their property, because land, people like us, indigenous community, is the life, is economy, is the culture, is spirituality. So we cannot like bring external influence of conservation to take our synagogues. You know, we might not be going to church, but we have our own thinking of what the religions look like.
Excellent. I know there are so many unanswered questions from the chat, but and now we don't have time to answer all of them. But don't worry, our team is working on a briefing paper that will come out of this, and we will incorporate all these questions like in our briefing papers. And now I would like to hand over back to Mr. Schiffer for the final phase, and much appreciation to our panelists.
Yes, so thank you very much for these really interesting insights into the topic and also for answering the questions coming from our audience. But we don't want to end with the status quo, as you described it in several different ways also. But even more important for us is look into the future and how it should or how it could develop in the future. That's why we would like to ask the speakers to give us a short final statement and take-home message for our audience on how they see the possible future developments in regards to conservation. So James, maybe you can start by giving us how do you see possible future developments in this field?
The future is in taking a landscape approach to conservation that guarantees a win-win situation for people and wildlife. I believe that communities like Joseph's can live harmoniously and can continue to live harmoniously with wildlife without the overbearing hand of government and without distractions from external forces. They need to take charge and be seen to be taking charge. Our role as NGOs, roles of development partners, is to empower them, make sure that they have the correct institutions that they would require to manage the wildlife on their land, make sure that where it is necessary, besides indigenous knowledge, how can they get scientific or other knowledges, arms of knowledge that can help to enhance the conservation of wildlife, to help them to reach markets, whether it is ecotourism or livestock, so that they can improve their lot, to put in the right social amenities within these landscapes so that they can enjoy good living to the extent possible, like other communities, without jeopardizing their own culture. So I foresee a world where we can still turn things around, engage with communities more honestly, with everything on top of the table, so that they can continue to keep wildlife on their land with assistance from organizations like IFO. Thank you.
Joseph, what do you want to give us as a short take-home message?
Okay, my short message is, and I think this is a very ideal conversation. Conservation is
Joseph, we can't hear you, unfortunately, anymore.
Our ecosystem to... Okay. Maybe is network issue?
Yeah, I think it's the connection. So maybe, Karin, can you maybe just jump in and share us your opinion and your point of view? What should the participants of this panel discussion take home?
But very concretely, that we're starting to monitor and to expose this displacement systematically. So we scandalize the kind of somehow more muted conflict that is there, and we seem to have agreed that the conflict exists, so it has to get into the political sphere. And I think the German government is supporting promising approaches on ecological agriculture in the knowledge hubs, supported by the BMZ in Africa. There are promising results, so we have to think that approach of knowledge hubs into ecological agriculture together with conservation efforts in biodiversity. And as for that, it has to be formally mentioned and named that there are alternative approaches that exist that do not rely and do not need displacements, and have that as a formal and therefore also binding, therefore also enforceable perhaps request. And then on a more philosophical level, I mean, the EU has been promoting and pushing for a neoliberal approach for a long time as well. So and we now see with climate crisis and biodiversity loss that we can't just go ahead of heating up fossil fuels. And some are saying Olivier Hamon calls this a burnout society. So we have to move away from a burnout society with burnout people and burnout fossil fuels and land, and move to something where we reconsider and revalue subsistence agriculture is not just a backwatered agriculture. It's a way to regenerate, reproduce, remaintain land on which we live and on which we live and off which we live to sustain ourselves. And in current kind of crisis of climate change, sustaining is what we need to invest in, and not accelerating and intensifying and increasing and burning ever more fossil fuel and human energy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this very, very important statement. Joseph, can you hear us? And maybe can you give us now your
Yes,
short...
I do.
Perfect.
I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I was saying that this is a very ideal conversation we should be having moving forward. Even in the community that I'm from, the conservation has never been a problem. But the problem influenced by other factors is the real problem. And I think we need all to be thinking of a conservation of the future, that what we need our grandchildren to see is not at the expense of the living people. So we must also, because we cannot have the offspring without protecting the living. And we should literally find some way to accommodate different interests, of course, and put away the things that are not conservation, which I said mostly like things like hunting and different others. Yes, there are many actors who are trying, and it's always important to bring this issue into public discussions, and particularly to also see the other side of conservation. You know, it's an occipital industry, so how the tourists enjoy is so good. But what happened with other people is so awkward. So we need to treat the people living in the ecosystem as we treat the clients, because the land is theirs, and they should enjoy it because they're human beings. They proceed from their own environment. Otherwise, I'm really happy to be here, and this is a very good topic for all of us.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you to all of you for sharing your insights and perspectives on this really relevant and current topic in the nexus of conservation efforts and human rights. So today we started by having our panelists giving us a short introductory statement into the topic from their own perspective and field of work. Following this, we got insights on which costs and benefits conservation strategies have. Henceforth, we looked into important points on German role in preventing and reinforcing local land use conflicts. And an important point we focused on in the third block of our panel was the question how ownership over nature conservation can be encouraged and handed over to indigenous people and local communities. I think we had a really interesting Q&A session where we would delve deeper into some aspects which were brought up by the audience. And at the end, we even took a little glance into how the future development in this field could or should look like. As we now come to an end with our discussion, I would like to take the opportunity again to first of all thank all the panelists, James, Joseph, and Karin, for their time and openness to share their views and expertise in this panel. Also, given the fact that it was difficult for us to find panelists who had the time and were willing to be part of our panel. We find it a great pity that unfortunately no representative of the German Governmental Development Corporation was able to be part of the panel today. A big thank you also goes to the SLE and HBS for giving us the platform to facilitate such an interesting event. Huge thanks also to our interested audience who actively took part in the discussion by asking important questions. A last thank you again goes to our team in the background, namely Kolja, Regan, Tom, Lisa, Anna, Sonia, and Luisa, and to my co-moderation today, Katharina. Thank you again. We are now sharing a link to a short evaluation on today's discussion, and we would be really thankful to get an answer to see what we can improve in our upcoming, but also future panel discussions. For all of you who might be interested in reading more about the topic, as Marcus already said at the beginning, in the following weeks, we will publish a policy paper based on today's discussion, so stay tuned. And another remark, today between 4 and 6 p.m. Central European Time, you are invited to take part in another discussion on the question in the shadow of colonial culpability, Can Germany meet demands for restorative justice through bilateral development cooperation? From my side, thank you for your attention, and we wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for taking the time.
Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.